In the last video, we were discussing how 1949 and 1950 were not really good years for the Truman administration and for Harry Truman in particular. And one of the things that changed the world, changed the focus of the United States especially, and the Soviet Union, was that in 1949, September of 1949, the Soviets announced to the world that they had exploded their own atomic bomb. This changes the focus of American policy because as Harry Truman received from the bureaucracy a report, the National Security Council, newly created National Security Council, doing what the National Security Council does, studying American policy and American programs, presented to President Truman a document called NSC-68, National Security Council document number 68. Now, presidents get these documents all the time, but what was significant about this particular document is it said, in essence, the United States had been living in a dream, a fantasy land. That the United States, while from 1945 on, it had a monopoly on the atomic bomb, no other country having it, that the United States could force the world to its will. That it was that sledgehammer that could be used to pry other nations in line with us. But after September 1949, that has changed. NSC-68 said there should be an overhaul of the American military-industrial complex, that there should be a top-to-bottom assessment, and that no longer would the United States have that trump card of atomic weaponry to coerce other nations to follow our will. In fact, NSC-68 recommended at the very minimum a tripling of American defense spending. This was an astronomical figure that Truman believed would bust the budget. And although things look bleak in the world, you have the Arab-Israeli war wrapping up in the Middle East. You have Chiang Kai-shek in Formosa with China, the communist Chinese, saber-rattling about wiping out Formosa and Taiwan, and that it still belonged to the communist Chinese, and there's the potential for continued conflict there. You've recently had the spectacle of the Berlin airlift and Stalin posturing throughout Europe, but there's no real threat anywhere in the world that NSC-68 would indicate we need to build up conventional forces. In fact, that's the heart of NSC-68, is that conventional weaponry was as vital in this new age as atomic weaponry. Of course, you have to have the atomic weaponry. It serves as a check to the Soviets now having the bomb. But you also need something short of ultimate weaponry. That you have to have the tanks, the airplanes, the ships, the guns to fight a conventional war. And NSC-68 said the United States was inadequate to fight any war short of an atomic war. And now with the Soviets having the bomb and what would later be called mutually assured destruction now on the table, that's not really an option any longer. Well, President Truman did what any president would do with such horrific report. He threw it in the trash. I'm not saying that sarcastically. He filed it for attention later, but he's not going to break the budget when there's no direct threat to American sovereignty. There's no impending crisis on the horizon. Little did he know that Joe Stalin needed something to bolster his control in the Soviet Union. If Harry Truman had been able to sit in on a Kremlin strategy session, he would have heard how the leaders of the Soviet Union desperately needed something to save face. They needed some area in the world after the debacle of the Berlin airlift to show communist superiority. And while China going communist was a huge step forward for communism, anybody who studied communism knows that Soviet communism and Chinese communism are worlds apart. They're very strange and odd bedfellows. And so that's not necessarily a step forward for Russia. In fact, China might well become a rival rather than an ally. And so Stalin desperately needs an area of the globe in which there can be some communist success. And in searching for that place, he's given cues by American missteps, misspeaks in foreign policy speeches by President Truman and others within the State Department, who in delineating where American priorities lie, while including Japan in that sphere of protection, they excluded South Korea. South Korea, Korea is known as the land of the morning calm. It had been a crossroads of invasion for centuries. I mean, look at its location. To the northeast, you have the Soviet Union. To the northwest, you have China. To the east, you have Japan. And so poor Korea had been the crossroads for Japanese or Chinese invasions for millennia. But now, in the 1950s, since the Japanese had last controlled Korea, and at the end of World War II, and you can see on the map the port labeled as Vladivostok. Vladivostok is a Soviet Pacific port. It's instrumental in Soviet operations in the Sea of Japan, and so they are really interested in who controls Korea. As the Japanese are withdrawn from Korea at the end of World War II, the United States, who now occupies Japan as the conquering power, oversees Japanese affairs until Japan has been rehabilitated from World War II. The United States now controls the southern portion of the Korean Peninsula, divided at the 38th parallel. The northern portion of Korea was given to the other victor in the Pacific realm, the Soviet Union. And so both sides administering Korea, putting in place allies that reflect their interest. Now in Japan, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur is serving as governor of Japan, as occupation governor, overseeing Japanese affairs and the war party removal of anybody who served in the Japanese war party from government and the rehabilitation, if you will, of the Japanese government. And so he's directly interested in Korean affairs, but the State Department leaves this Korea out of American interest and American sphere of protection. Even though in South Korea, the United States had established and I don't want to call it a puppet regime, that has a negative connotation. We will call it a surrogate. It's Koreans controlling Korea, and the United States, by all indication in the literature, desired for Korea to have an independent course, but we want a Korea that is in line with American interest. Remember, America is a Pacific power. From our interest in the Philippines, which by 1950, the Philippines were granted independence in 1946, but the United States still has a massive naval base. They still have interest all throughout the Pacific realm. And the United States is very much interested, despite what the State Department said, in the furthering of the Korean Peninsula and the establishment of friendly relations, especially as a buffer or insulator to what will now become one of our strongest allies, Japan. So in South Korea, the United States puts a pro-capitalist government, a pro-republic government, calling it the Republic of South Korea, with a constitution similar to the United States. You don't want to give Korea a reproduction of the U.S. Constitution. The United States Constitution was a product of our historical experience. And where in most countries you're not going to get a two-party system, and you're not going to get the federalist nature of states and central government working together. Instead, in most of the countries where the United States liberates, the Constitution that we helped them create, while predicated on the principles of our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, guaranteeing those inalienable rights that Jefferson so eloquently wrote about, instead of giving them a reproduction of our government, we instead reflect the diverse nature of their country and give them a parliamentary system. And so as president of South Korea, Syngman Rhee, who was married to an American woman, had been educated in America. He's pro-Western, pro-United States. He's the perfect choice. Now, let me put a caveat in there. As the war progresses, Syngman Rhee shows some dictatorial tendencies, and he does some things that especially makes modern Americans uncomfortable. He allows for, or some would even say he orders, a number of massacres of pro-communist communities in South Korea during the war. Now, you have to put that in context. As the war progresses and the communists control South Korea, there are millions of South Koreans put to death by the communists. And so this cycle of retaliation begins, and Syngman Rhee gets caught up in it. Now, that doesn't justify his actions, but it puts it a little more in perspective. But the Republic of South Korea, with President Syngman Rhee in the south, and in the north, reflecting exactly what we're doing in the south and the Soviets are doing in the north. A Korean who had spent the war in the Soviet Union, had been educated in Soviet universities, who had spent his wartime experience learning with the Red Army. So just exactly like what we're doing in the South. And I've seen some of my colleagues, not necessarily at UT Tyler, but in other institutions who talk about this period, attacking the United States for its colonialism. Well, so too are the Soviet Union. They're engaging in the same type, but we're doing it through locals. We're doing it through the establishment of governments that are friendly to us. It's insane to ask the United States to go into South Korea and establish a government friendly to somebody else. We're the victor. We go in and we establish a regime friendly to us, and the Soviets do the same. And so Kim Il-sung, his original name was Kim Song-ju, and typical of communist leaders, he changes his name as he becomes the premier of Korea. He changes it to Kim Il-sung, which is something along the lines of badass leader. Most communist leaders, Ho Chi Minh does the same thing in Vietnam. They change their name from their birth name to something that has a more popular appeal. So Kim Il-sung, who's the grandfather of the current leader of North Korea, establishes the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, a pro-communist government. As you can see, the red star on their badge, the red star on their flag. They're very much in line with Soviet doctrine. And in fact, for years after the outbreak of the Korean War, there's going to be an argument amongst the academics of the West. Does Kim Il-sung attack South Korea because he wanted to reunite the peninsula and solidify his rule without the threat from South Korea, or was he pushed to do it by Stalin? And for decades, scholars fought over which direction to go. Now, with the fall of the Soviet Union and the opening of the Soviet archives, we know without a doubt Stalin was behind the attack in Korea. He was testing Western resolve. He was attempting to save face from his failure in Berlin. And so he pushes Kim Song-ju, or Kim Il-sung, whichever you prefer, into attacking South Korea. The difference between the two is the United States didn't arm Syngman Rhee with much more than a police force. The Republic of South Korea had 100,000 men in 8 divisions scattered across the South. They had little supporting artillery. They had no tanks, no heavy artillery, no combat aircraft, and limited reserves. Little more than a police force. On the other hand, Stalin had armed Kim Il-sung to the teeth. They had a 130,000-man army on the border, 10 divisions equipped with Russian T-34 medium tanks, which was considered one of the top-line Soviet tanks. It's not their baddest tank by any means. Stalin keeps those for himself. But T-34 tanks were quite dependable on the battlefield. If you could get them to the battlefield, they had ongoing mechanical problems. But once they were on the battlefield and serviced, they were some of the best armor that the Nazis ever faced in World War II. But this is 1950, and these are World War II surplus. The North Koreans also had 180 Russian fighter planes of World War II vintage. World War II vintage or not, that's only 5 years prior, and it's way more than the South has. On June 25th, 1950, with radio broadcasts that the South was attacking the North, just like Hitler had done in Poland and elsewhere. In fact, kind of ironic, I had to get a good laugh as I was working on this PowerPoint and going to various sites to look for pictures and to study up on the conflict. There was a North Korean website, and it's simply amazing. All of the captions on the pictures and the narrative were 180 degrees from what has been studied in the West. They talk about the Korean War as the defensive war, that the South had attacked the North. Well, the South doesn't have anything to attack. So while radio broadcasts are going out on the airwaves that the South is attacking, it was in fact those northern divisions raced across the 38th parallel and simply ripped through the South Korean defense forces. And within just days, they have not only passed the 38th parallel, but they're threatening the very outskirts of Seoul, the capital of South Korea, Seoul, South Korea. And the first Battle of Seoul, and I'm being generous calling it a battle, it was more of a collapse, the capture of Seoul on June 27th, 1950. What the North Koreans are going to try to do, and looking at this map, they're going to try to race down the peninsula as fast as possible, sweeping aside all opposition and taking the entire peninsula before the West can react. Now remember, right across the Sea of Japan is the U.S. Army in Japan. Now while it has demobilized and it's nowhere near the size, the strength, the equipage, or the zeal of the 1945 U.S. Army, it's still an impressive force. And so the goal of the North Koreans is to wipe out all opposition as quickly as possible and present to the world a done deal. Hey, you divided us, we've reunited us, the South Korean government was here for a few days, they're gone now, so long, farewell, admit us into the United Nations. So the North Koreans are trying to move as quickly as possible, and the capture of Seoul certainly facilitates that. The American reaction, though, is far different than Stalin predicted. He predicted that the United States wouldn't defend Korea, that they would just let it go as a fait accompli, and they would deal with the fallout from it later. But with that guiding doctrine that we talked about in the last video of containment, that changes American strategy. Truman is obligated by his own policy. He has to defend South Korea. But he doesn't want to make it appear as an American unilateral action. He wants it to be a world coalition. And so Harry Truman goes before the United Nations and has the United Nations Security Council approve American involvement. Now that takes some explanation, you see, because the UN Security Council is composed of the top powers from World War II, and the big four, the United States, Great Britain, China, Russia, add France in there, so five. They have absolute veto power. They can veto any bill that comes before the UN in general or the Security Council in particular. So, you have a Soviet ambassador on the council. Why doesn't he veto it? Because obviously Stalin doesn't want the United States getting involved, and if the United Nations had vetoed it, then the United States would have had to have acted alone. But instead, as the resolution is presented to the Security Council, it's passed unanimously by those in attendance. You see, the Soviet ambassador to the United Nations was boycotting the United Nations. He was boycotting the United Nations because of China. The Chinese delegate to the United Nations was still a nationalist Chinese, a supporter of Chiang Kai-shek. But Mao Zedong has taken over China. And so the Soviet ambassador is boycotting because he wanted the Chinese ambassador replaced with a communist Chinese. So while he's out boycotting, the United Nations brings this resolution in. It's unanimously passed, even by the Chinese representative, who's the Republic of China. And the United States is given a mandate by the United Nations to liberate South Korea. With UN resolution in hand, Harry Truman orders a military response. He orders General Douglas MacArthur in Japan to gather up as many units as possible and create what would amount to an ad hoc force and get them into Korea as soon as possible. That air power and naval power are not going to be enough to stop the North Koreans. There's a very strong parallel here between what's going on in Korea and what's going on with ISIS today. Air power and naval power are not going to be enough. You have to put boots on the ground. You have to put troops in combat to end the aggression. And so an American response comes with an ad hoc unit called Task Force Smith, named for Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith, who led the U.S. forces. It was only about 540 U.S. forces. And they would meet the oncoming North Koreans in the Battle of Osan. Now, this was you can see from the numbers just in this one battle, and there are other areas in which the North Koreans are racing southward. This is just one spot that we choose to make a stand. And Task Force Smith picks the perfect location, got a nice ambush spot, and as the Russian T-34 tanks, driven by North Korean drivers, come out of this narrow pass, you can see the bazookaman with a bazooka that it was used against German tanks just very recently. They're waiting in an ambush with their anti-tank guns, with their bazookas. They fire off their first volley and watch them bounce off of the T-34 armor. Now, Task Force Smith, giving them credit, they fight all day long, but the tank superiority of Task Force Smith, I mean, this is a very quickly assembled American force. It doesn't have any tanks with them, so it's trying to stop the North Koreans with anti-tank forces minus any tanks, and the anti-tank weaponry is not up to the task. They're quickly outflanked and forced to retreat. So what then follows is a fighting withdrawal to what became known as the Pusan Perimeter. Now there are, and you can see the picture up top, a North Korean T-34 tank that has been stopped. A tank with no treads is called a rock. And once a tank is knocked out and can't maneuver, then infantry can get close enough or behind it that the anti-tank weapons are effective. But so the American forces, along with the South Korean forces, engage in a fighting retreat to the Pusan perimeter. You can see on the map that by the time August rolls around, remember all this started in July, so within the span of a month, this is all that's left of South Korea, the Pusan perimeter. All the rest of the Korean peninsula belongs to North Korea. And they are working to consolidate it. They're eliminating opposition. They're engaged in purges in Seoul. Death squads are going through Seoul, South Korea, rounding up anybody who supported the South Korean government that was still there. Most of the South Korean government officials fled to Japan or are in Pusan behind the American forces. But those who remained, and we're talking governors, teachers, minor political officials, they're rounded up and executed. And later there will be mass graves found in Seoul of thousands upon thousands of South Korean citizens that were just executed. And this happens in city after city. The defense of the Pusan perimeter and the responsibility for American troops in Korea and the coalition, by the way, this isn't just American action. There are Brits, there are Turkish forces. The entire coalition that you saw, all those nations that were on the UN resolution, they contribute to the war in Korea. Some more than others, but it is a broad spectrum coalition that fights the North Koreans that are primarily limited and later in the war to Chinese and Russian support. But Lieutenant General Walton Walker is given the responsibility of defending South Korea and being in charge of the American reaction. And as reinforcements are available from August through September, they're fed into the Pusan perimeter. In fact, I was reading a first-hand account the other day of one of the brand new American tanks that had been developed at the end of World War II, the Pershing tank. And as they didn't know how it was going to do against the T-34, and they get a report of 3 T-34 tanks coming through a narrow pass, pushing into the Pusan perimeter. And so they bring forward one of the Pershing tanks and set him up to block the advance. And he opens fire on the T-34 tanks, and the commander, who's got a very well-trained crew, is watching the shells, and he sees them exploding way off in the distance, and he's chastising his gunner over the intercom. Why are you overshooting those tanks? And the gunner's like, I'm not. Well, later after the battle, they realized that the American shells were going completely through the Russian tanks and exploding in the distance. And as they examined the wreckage of the T-34s, they all had multiple entrance and exit holes as they had been destroyed by the American tanks. So what equipment does arrive is more effective than what the Russians have supplied. But remember, in SC-68, we don't have a lot of conventional forces, so it's going to take time to build up a force that can respond. And so from August to September, Walton Walker has to hold on to the Pusan perimeter so as there's a bridgehead, if you will, from which they can push back. In steps the genius of Douglas MacArthur. He proposes a radical solution. He said, rather than feeding more reinforcements into the Pusan perimeter and fighting a conventional war and pushing them back and all of the attrition that will take place with that, why not, in his words, break the bottle? Come from Japan and land directly on the west side of Korea, near the port of Incheon, advance inland and retake Seoul and put up a anvil position, block off the 38th parallel, with the North Korean army trapped at the Pusan perimeter. Then the American Pusan perimeter forces can push the North Korean army into the anvil, so it's called a hammer and anvil, and the North Korean army can be destroyed in detail. Either way, by the United States controlling their supply lines, the North Korean army is going to run out of supplies. The problem is, Incheon has some of the largest tides in the world. And when the tide goes out, the landing force is going to be isolated for half a day. And anything can happen in an amphibious landing. MacArthur puts his reputation and his job on the line. He tells the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you either approve this landing or I will resign. I'll shake up the whole Pacific theater by resigning, and then it's on your head. And so the Joint Chiefs of Staff reluctantly approve of the Incheon landings, and the Incheon landings are successful, almost without opposition. There's light opposition. The U.S. force is able to take Incheon, push inland, take Seoul, and begin the process of putting a blocking force in place to be the anvil. Now, I put a solid line there, but that's simply impossible considering the manpower that MacArthur had and the terrain. You see, Korea isn't just a flat peninsula. There's a ridge of mountains that runs north to south that is almost like a spine. And so while the North Korean army at Pusan is cut off from its supplies, and they filter back northward to try to get back to North Korea, and Walton Walker and his forces are hot on their tail, MacArthur is unable to totally seal off the border. And so while many North Korean units are destroyed, quite a few get across the border and take refuge in North Korea. This leads MacArthur to ask Truman for authorization to pursue into North Korea. Truman goes back to the United Nations and gets a continuing resolution from the United Nations to unite the Korean Peninsula under the government of South Korea. And so continuing as a UN action, the U.S. and South Korean forces are going to retake up to the 38th parallel, fighting the Second Battle of Seoul, retaking the city. And if you look closely, if any of you know anything about tanks, you'll see that this is a British Cromwell tank from World War II pushing through the streets of Seoul, South Korea. And you can see an American Sherman tank climbing a barrier in the roadway. And you see Douglas MacArthur returning control of Seoul back to Syngman-rhee. So the Second Battle of Seoul, by September 25th, Seoul is back in South Korean hands. And MacArthur launches an invasion of North Korea. Pushing northward, you see the bombing of the northern North Korean capital of Pyongyang. And that's the railhead being destroyed here. The attacks, the three pictures here are attacks in and around Pyongyang, and the capture of the North Korean capital itself. This is the first war in which helicopters are extensively used, even these god-awful Oscar Mayer Wiener-looking helicopters. But American use of air mobility virtually eliminates the North Korean army as a fighting force. You can see American troops in Kim Il-sung's office. And whose picture is behind that? This is supposedly, to listen to my colleagues on the left who argue that Stalin was just remotely involved. North Korean dictators stylize themselves as the glorious leader. And who does the glorious leader have a picture behind him representing his leader? Joe Stalin. Now, that's not acne that Stalin's picture has broken out with. The American troops, when they took Kim Il-sung's office, might have shot Stalin's picture a few times with rifles. Oops, we're sorry. Looks like you're going to need a new picture. But the American troops then push further northward, leaving North Korea only 3 sections of isolated defensive pockets near the Yalu River and the border with China. As the United States drew closer and closer to China, there were increasing warnings coming from the Communist Chinese, from Premier Mao Zedong, warning the United States not to come any closer to China, not to eliminate North Korea as a force, and to withdraw. Truman became so concerned about events that he ordered General MacArthur to meet with him in Washington, D.C. Douglas MacArthur's response to President Truman was something to the effect of, can't you see I'm fighting a war here? Do you really want the commander of the Pacific Theater flying out of his command to visit with a politician on the other side of the globe? Really? Truman should have told MacArthur to get his butt to D.C. and meet with him. Instead, Truman agrees to meet MacArthur halfway. And so the two meet on Wake Island in the middle of the Pacific. The first time that President Truman has met MacArthur. MacArthur has little or no respect for Truman. Truman thinks MacArthur's a prima donna. Nonetheless, the first meeting is rather cordial. Truman gives MacArthur another Distinguished Service Medal. The two meet in secret, with Truman expressing his concerns about Chinese warnings. MacArthur reassures Truman that the Chinese are cowards, they will not get involved, and this war will be wrapped up by Christmas. No sooner does Truman fly back to Washington, MacArthur gets back to Japan, then the Chinese attack. Chinese attacks November 24th, as reports begin coming in that the Chinese are attacking in force. MacArthur flies over the front lines, flies for many hours, by the way, very close to the North Korean lines, for which the air crews, the Air Force awards MacArthur a honorary combat wings and a Distinguished Flying Cross for having reconned near enemy lines. Pure tail kissing by the part of the Air Force to MacArthur. But on November 24th, 1950, the Japanese attack in force, hitting all along the front. What had been estimated as just a few thousand Chinese in North Korea aiding the North Koreans turned out to be well over 180,000. Some even estimate as much as 300,000 Chinese already in North Korea, and they simply overwhelm American defenses. So on Thanksgiving Day, 1950, American forces isolated along the northern front are hit by Chinese forces in weather unlike anything you can imagine. I've seen videos of this. There's an amazing A&E or Discovery Channel video called Our Time in Hell. And this big old Marine, he's in his 70s, 80s now, but back in the day he was probably an 18-year-old Marine. And he talked about getting his Thanksgiving dinner that was delivered to the front, and it was so cold that by the time he walked from the chow line to his foxhole, his coffee had frozen solid in his mess cup. His turkey and dressing weren't even warm; they were ice. You ate it anyway because that's the food you had. The Marines are going to be isolated and surrounded at a place called Choson Reservoir, and they're forced to fight their way out. And you can see on the east side of the map them fighting their way to the coast. And then the Marines are evacuated by the Navy. And to the west and the center, the Army retreats back toward the 38th parallel. In the midst of the retreat, General Walton Walker is killed in a Jeep wreck and is replaced by General Matthew Ridgway, who would then begin conducting the retreat back across the 38th parallel. American troops are at low morale and in fast retreat by December 31st. So instead of being home by Christmas, Seoul has been retaken by the communists in what was called the Third Battle of Seoul. So from December 31st to January 7th, 1951, the Chinese and American coalition, you can see the turned over Cromwell tank there in Seoul with the British flag over it. The Chinese retake Seoul and continue pushing American troops southward on past Seoul, and apparently going to push America off of the Korean Peninsula. General MacArthur becomes increasingly critical of President Truman's conduct of the war. MacArthur's wanted to do a number of things. He says all these troops and supplies are coming from China, and they're being aided by Chinese air power. He asked for permission to use atomic bombs against Chinese airfields. Now, while Chinese troops are fighting in North Korea, there's been no Chinese attacks against Japan or American installations elsewhere. And Truman's afraid that if you start using atomic weapons, then China's going to ask the Soviet Union for an atomic weapon, and Korea could become a battleground of atomic weaponry. So Truman says no. MacArthur becomes highly critical of Truman's response, and even goes so far as to publicly criticize the president in the media. Truman orders MacArthur to keep his mouth shut, to quit talking about his command. MacArthur then suggests one other thing, and this is more likely the reason China became involved. If you look at a general map of, let me back up to an overview map, with Japan off the coast, Russia to the northeast, China to the northwest, MacArthur had suggested down to the southwest is the island of Formosa, where Chiang Kai-shek and the remnants of the Republic of China Army are located. MacArthur suggests that we ought to use North Korea as a staging ground to bring Chiang Kai-shek back to the continent and let Chiang Kai-shek re-enter China and reawaken the Chinese Civil War, undermining Mao and hopefully destabilizing China to the point that you roll back communism, which is the next logical step from containment. Truman, of course, refused, and in refusing, MacArthur again criticizes. In fact, MacArthur sends a letter to the Republican minority leader in the House, and the Republican minority leader reads it into the congressional record. Open criticism of the president. With the Congressman Joseph Martin Jr., by the way. With that was simply over the top. And so President Truman decides to fire General MacArthur. Rather than calling MacArthur and telling him that he's fired, Truman insists till his dying day that in Korea was the Secretary of the Army, Frank Pace, was in Korea at the time. Truman sends a message to Secretary Pace and orders him to get to Japan, to Tokyo, and fire MacArthur in person. But Pace is in country in Korea. He's not able to get to Tokyo that quickly. And before he can get there, Truman has the news leaked to the news media, And MacArthur hears that he is fired over the radio. He doesn't even get an official message from the Joint Chiefs of Staff or from the White House. He hears about it on Armed Services Radio that he's been fired. This creates a feud for the rest of their lives between MacArthur and Truman. Now, Truman did try to do the right thing, but my personal feeling is that Truman had a feeling and he just wanted to stick a fork in MacArthur. And so Douglas MacArthur is dismissed as commander of the Pacific Theater and ordered home. Truman makes a huge mistake in this, at least in the public's mind. And as Truman makes his way home for the first time in decades, he is treated as the conquering hero. In fact, when William Manchester writes his biography of Douglas MacArthur, he entitles it American Caesar. As MacArthur flies home and arrives in Honolulu, he's treated to a parade. When he arrives in San Francisco, he's treated to a parade. He lands in Chicago, he's treated to a parade. New York City throws him a ticker tape parade. He's invited to speak before a joint session of Congress. Even Democrats that support the president don't support the president on this issue. I mean, MacArthur is one of the most successful generals that the United States has ever produced. And he's been dismissed by a president that is questionably popular. And so Truman takes a huge blow to his popularity. Now, in the end, it proved to be the right thing. Truman showed true leadership, firing a popular general in the face of public opposition, in the face of negative press. He did what he needed to do. The civilian government controls the military in the United States. MacArthur had been warned. He was actively engaged in insubordination. He was undermining the president's authority, and Truman was left with no recourse. Now, how he did it, that's a different story. But he did the right thing in firing MacArthur. The new commander that had replaced General Walker in Korea, General Matthew Ridgway, is now elevated to Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in the Pacific. And General James Fleet is named Commander of Ground Forces in Korea. Now, General Ridgway, a former airborne commander from World War II, pardon the expression, but he was always called, his nickname was Iron Tits, because he usually appeared, now the picture I have of him on the far left shows him in his dress uniform, but when he was wearing his normal uniform, he always carried a hand grenade on one side. Now, his troops made fun of him because it looked like he had two hand grenades, but in fact, what was on the left side was a first aid kit. So he had a hand grenade and a first aid kit that he always wore when he was in the theater or even in the office. And he was a no-nonsense commander that ordered American forces to stop where they were and to make a stand. The bottom line that you see, January 1951, is the point at which General Ridgway orders American forces to make a stand. And then from January 1951 to April of 1951, American and Allied forces push back and reestablish the 38th parallel as the front lines. And so as the Seoul is retaken for the 4th Battle of Seoul, which was included in a much larger operation called Operation Ripper, but March 7th through April 4th, a month, they fought over the area in and around Seoul before retaking it and restoring it yet once again to Syngman-rhee. With the line reestablished at the 38th parallel, the United States began seeking a chance to end the conflict. Every time the request is made, either the Chinese or the North Koreans find an excuse to not end the conflict. In fact, we now know that behind the refusals was Joe Stalin. But that changes over the course of the Korean War when Joe Stalin dies, and in the power vacuum that's left, the Chinese and the North Koreans are forced to ask for a peace. And so as the stalemate continues into the line maintained at the DMZ, at the armistice line, April 1951 that you see on the map, that's going to continue through 1951 into 1952. 1952 is an election year, which we'll talk about the election in the next video. But it's an election year. One of the candidates, Dwight Eisenhower, is going to promise to go to Korea and bring an end to the war if he's elected. And certainly with a president of Dwight Eisenhower's stature, the North Koreans and the Chinese, fearful that Eisenhower will use atomic weapons. In fact, Eisenhower lets that be a poorly kept secret. You see, Truman was good at gambling, so too was Dwight Eisenhower. Whether Eisenhower would have used atomic weaponry remains to be seen. In fact, isn't that the hallmark of a good poker player? You don't know if he's bluffing. Eisenhower let it be a poorly kept secret that he had ordered atomic weapon-armed bombers to Japan, and that those bombers would be used to hit targets in North Korea if they didn't bring the conflict to an end. The talks are stalled over the issue of prisoners of war. UN troops have captured some 92,000 Chinese and North Korean troops. The Chinese have a similar number, 10,000 American troops, 80,000 Koreans, and 2,500 others. We don't know for certain how many POWs the Chinese had because they never accurately reported the totals. And in fact, American prisoners of war were treated quite brutally in Chinese prison camps, and thousands died at the hands of Chinese captors. I gave you the wrong. 92,000 UN troops had been captured by the Chinese. The United States and its allies had captured 171,000 communist troops. The Chinese demanded that 100% of their prisoners that the U.S. had captured, that their soldiers had to be returned to China. The problem is there were tens of thousands of Chinese troops that requested political asylum, didn't want to go back to communist China because they had Republic of Chinese leanings, because they wanted to escape to the West, whatever. They refused to return. One historian puts the figure at 50,000 Chinese didn't want to go back. And so, do you make prisoners of war go back to China that don't want to go home? Well, the answer is yes. And in 1953, with the death of Stalin, March 5th, 1953, the two forces meet with the election of Dwight Eisenhower, and Eisenhower visiting the Korean Peninsula and putting pressure on the Chinese and North Koreans. The two sides meet in a neutral zone, a little city created in the neutral zone just for these purposes. They sign an armistice with Lieutenant General William Harrison Jr. signing for the United States and General Nam Il signing for the North Koreans. The Korean conflict isn't brought to a peace treaty, it's brought to an end of the fighting. And that's why today there are still American forces in Korea, because the war could start back up at any moment. It is simply a cessation of hostilities. It's not a conclusion of the war. This is what was at risk and what it cost both sides in the Korean conflict. The United States, and you can read the numbers for yourself, but the United States loses 36,000 plus killed in action, 103,000 wounded, and 8,000 missing. Of those, we know almost 5,000 were prisoners of war. You see the South Korean losses. 2.5 million civilians were killed in the conflict. On the other side, these are all, I put the C period circa because we don't have ironclad figures. But we know somewhere in the realm of 1.5 million civilians were killed in North Korea. We know that communist forces lost somewhere around 500,000. There was almost 1 million, almost 800,000 wounded. Just massive loss of life. So the question I ask you, was this the right war at the right place with the right enemy? Well, if you put it in the broad perspective of containment, the answer is yes. Was Soviet expansion contained? Yes. Was Stalin behind the Korean War? Yes. Did the Korean conflict sharpen the Cold War? Certainly yes. And once again, with the death of Stalin, there's going to become an easing, but not an elimination of hostilities. But the United States endured some valuable lessons. Whether they learned them or not, that remains to be seen. But it's going to put a bitter taste in the mouth of the United States that North Korea still exists, and there's this unholy peace that reigns in South Korea. But nonetheless, the United States was able to extract itself while maintaining a presence, while maintaining containment, at least for now. And we'll pick up with the affluent society in the next video.